Thank you for having me here today. This is something of a challenge for me. I had a stroke last August, so when I get tired, I sound drunk to me. If I start to become unclear, wave your arms and I will slow down and force myself to carefully articulate every word. Arms control laws have a variety of roots in many cultures and often even before guns. These laws existed to protect the political status quo. In 1598, Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi ordered all, quote, swords, short swords, bows, spears, firearms, or other types of weapons, end quote, to be seized from farmers to discourage rebellion against the samurai. The claim was that the goal was to protect the farmers from being encouraged to rise in useless and bloody rebellions. Of course, as is usually the case, a religious excuse was developed as well. The confiscated weapons would be used to make a gargantuan statue of Buddha. As Hideyoshi's decree explained, in this way, farmers will benefit not only in this life but also in the lives to come. Within 2 centuries, high tax rates had starved entire Japanese villages to death and started the practice of farmers selling their daughters into prostitution to be able to feed the other kids. Only World War II brought an end in part to this medieval system of power. Europe was no different. Henry VIII passed a ban in 1514 on crossbows and handguns, by which he meant all guns less than 3 feet long, unless you met a property qualification. Theoretically, the goal was to encourage longbow practice because this was the weapon of the English army. The net effect was to limit the new arms technology to the rich. France also limited bow possession by peasants because of fear after the Jacques Rey Rebellion, at which time the intellectuals appealing to the upper classes so that the peasants should eat grass in the fields and not be asking for the right to eat meat. America presented an interesting situation for a traditional English institution, the militia. The militia had always consisted of the freemen of the society obligated to defend the realm from external attack and theoretically from internal rebellion. By the time the American colonies formed, the militia had been replaced by professional soldiers in England. The American colonies revived the militia because professional full-time armies are expensive. The colonies faced 3 threats: Indian attack, invasion and attack by foreign navies and armies, and as slavery became institutionalized in the latter half of the 17th century, fear of slave rebellion. Every colony but Pennsylvania by the start of the Revolution had a militia law requiring every able-bodied free man, usually aged 16 to 50, to be armed for militia duty and to turn out for militia musters or for combat. Most colonies experimented with laws banning sales of guns to Indians. Virginia actually made it a capital crime to travel too far from a village with more than 3 guns with the presumption that you were going to sell them to the Indians. These laws were generally unenforceable and largely disappeared by the time of the Revolution. Many, but not all, colonies prohibited slaves from possessing arms, including guns, clubs, swords, and dogs, because dogs were considered weapons. Often, slaves were allowed possession with the master's permission. Some colonies prohibited even the relatively rare free blacks from being armed. Often these disarmament laws are passed the same year that free blacks are prohibited from voting, such as Virginia in 1723. The courts sometimes explicitly recognized this connection between citizenship and both the right and duty to bear arms. The Georgia Supreme Court, in upholding a special tax on free blacks in Savannah, drew all the rights of citizenship together. Free persons of color have never been recognized as citizens. They are not entitled to bear arms, vote for members of the legislature, or to hold any civil office. Cooper and Worsham v. City of Savannah, Georgia, 1848. And of course, the Dred Scott decision of 1857 also explicated that if free blacks were citizens, quote, the Constitution would give them the full liberty of speech in public and in private upon all subjects upon which its own citizens might speak, and to hold public meetings upon political affairs, and to keep and carry arms wherever they went. After the Civil War, the struggle over black civil rights revolved around, even before voting, the right to self-defense against the Klan and less organized forms of intimidation. My paper, This Right is Not Allowed by Governments That Are Afraid of the People, the public meaning of the Second Amendment when the 14th Amendment was ratified, published in George Mason Law Review, was cited in McDonald v. Chicago 2010 as evidence that Southern gun control laws were one of the reasons why the 14th Amendment used the phrase privileges or immunities to include the right to keep and bear arms. Charles Cobb's recent memoir of his part in the civil rights movement details how the highly armed state of many Southern civil rights activists kept the movement alive through widespread domestic terrorism. His book includes a description of the difficulties he had in opening a door in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s home to because of the stacks of guns behind the door. Throughout most of its history, concealed weapon licensing was arbitrarily decided, usually based on race or campaign contributions. The reasons sometimes appear in the decisions of the courts. We have this astonishing statement from Justice Buford's concurring opinion in a 1941 Florida Supreme Court decision. He said, "I know something of the history of this legislation. The original Act of 1893 was passed when there was a great influx of Negro laborers in this state drawn here for the purpose of working in turpentine and lumber camps. The same condition existed when the Act was amended in 1901, and the Act was passed for the purpose of disarming the Negro laborers and to thereby reduce the unlawful homicides that were prevalent in turpentine and sawmill camps and to give the white citizens in sparsely settled areas a better feeling of security. The statute was never intended to be applied to the white population, and practice has never been so applied." California's current concealed weapon permit law, passed in 1923 as part of a package of provisions that prohibited non-citizens from possessing handguns and requiring background checks for handgun purchases. The KKK-endorsed governor signed the bill after a primary proponent of it explained in the San Francisco Chronicle that it would have, quote, "a salutary effect in checking tongue wars among the Chinese and vendettas among our people who are of Latin descent," unquote. At that time, remember, Chinese immigrants were still prohibited from naturalization as U.S. citizens, and millions of Mexicans had fled the Mexican Revolution into California. The replacement of the old-style discretionary permit laws has ended enormous amounts of discrimination and corruption in permit issuance around the country. This is not all ancient history either. Most recently, just a month or two ago, the primary funder of gun control in the U.S., Michael Bloomberg, told the progressive Aspen Institute that the focus of gun control should be minority men. Quote, "They just don't have any long-term focus or anything. It's a joke to have a gun. It's a joke to pull a trigger." What have been the results of all of this? Several generations of black men have grown up in societies where there was no lawful tradition of responsible gun ownership, either because it was essentially illegal like D.C. and Chicago, or the dominant media culture has trained the population to see gun ownership as suspect, such as New York City, California, or New Jersey. This has an effect on how guns are perceived, and not in a good way. Gun control has become the default response of progressives because the alternative is to ask what has gone wrong in black urban culture. About half of all murders in the U.S. are black on black. Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown are actually very atypical black deaths. Distracting attention from a culture of violence is just that, a distraction. If gun control has this history of association with what could be at best be considered reactionary thinkers, how did gun control become associated with liberal and progressive thought? Partly this was a response to the gun deaths of three icons of liberal politics, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Partly it is also because liberal and progressive thinkers are members of urban elites. By the 1960s, violent crime rates in cities with black populations had risen to intolerable levels. Rather than ask why this problem was concentrated in a group that the war on poverty was supposed to have helped, or confront their fears of young black men, it was easier to demonize guns.